He was mocked on live TV. 43 seconds later, Congress froze, and a black soldier became a global symbol of justice. What did Ibrahim Traoré reveal that America wasn't ready to face? The dust in the Sahel has a way of creeping into everything: your lungs, your boots, even your memories. Long before he became a symbol, before the headlines, before the nightmares whispered in Washington war rooms, Ibrahim Traoré was just a boy. Not much taller than a rifle, just a pair of sharp eyes watching a world unravel around him. He was 7 when the first coup happened. He didn't understand the speeches on the crackling state radio. He only remembered the sound of boots everywhere, men shouting in uniforms that didn't match. His mother pulled him behind a curtain as gunfire cracked somewhere near the market. His father stood at the window, stone-faced, arms crossed like a gatekeeper. "Don't look," he said. But Ibrahim looked. He saw soldiers drag a local school principal out of his home, accusing him of Western sympathies. The man's crime distributing books that weren't censored. That night, the principal vanished. So did the books. The next day, the school reopened, but history was missing. Burkina Faso at the time was a puppet theater of foreign interests. America had embassies. France had claws. China was knocking. The locals, they had silence. In the village of Bondokui, where Ibrahim grew up, the greatest currency wasn't gold or francs or weapons. It was knowing when to keep your mouth shut. But Ibrahim was a quiet observer, not a quiet thinker. While his peers played with sticks, he collected torn newspapers from trash bins behind government buildings. He couldn't read English then, but he kept the pages anyway. Something about the faces, the charts, the headlines, it called to him. It wasn't until he was 12 that he pieced it together. The names behind the coups were not always local. Sometimes they ended with a flag that wasn't Burkinabe. One day as a teenager, he found his father cleaning an old book with no title on the cover. Just a deep brown leather binding, like something smuggled through generations. "What's that?" Ibrahim asked. His father hesitated, then opened to a page that read in careful French, "L'unité africaine ne sera pas un rêve si elle est nourrie par la vérité." African unity will not be a dream if it is fed by truth. That was the first time Ibrahim heard the word Pan-Africanism. "It's dangerous," his father said, handing the book to him anyway. When he joined the military academy years later, Traoré didn't stand out. He vanished into routines. But beneath the camouflage and clean-cut exterior was a storm with a smile. He trained like a machine, top 5% of his class, tactical scores unmatched. Comrades called him Le Fantôme, the ghost, not because he was cold, but because he moved like someone always watching, always calculating. He never joined in political debates at the mess hall, never complained about commanders, never questioned orders out loud. But every time he heard U.S. advisors are coming next week or IMF wants budget cuts before aid release, he scribbled something into his small leather-bound journal, always in code, always in silence. One afternoon during joint training with a NATO delegation, an American officer patted Traoré on the back and laughed. "Hell of a shot, kid. Maybe someday you'll get to play in the big leagues." Traoré smiled politely, but inside something shifted. That night he wrote, "They think we are players, but we are the board." There was always something about his eyes, people said later. Too quiet, too focused, as if they were already scanning a map 10 years into the future. As if they'd already seen the fall and rise of empires. Even his own mother once said, he was born during a storm. The day he opened his eyes, the thunder stopped. But the dust didn't stop. It swirled around his boots during drills. It coated the documents he secretly copied. It filled the air the day he first stepped into the Capitol, not as a soldier, but as a man with a plan. What no one realized, what even Washington would learn too late, was that Burkina Faso's quietest soldier had been listening for years, and now he was about to speak. They came with smiles and briefcases, not boots and rifles, and yet somehow they conquered anyway. By the time Ibrahim Traoré entered the officer corps, West Africa was no longer ruled, it was managed. The colonial flags had come down long ago, but in their place were logos, Chevron, Lockheed, USAID, IMF. In the war rooms of Washington, Burkina Faso barely earned a full sentence, just a red dot in the Sahel. But to the architects of control, that dot was strategic. It had gold, it had uranium, it had proximity, and most importantly, it had leaders who could be bought. Behind the veil of foreign aid and counterterrorism cooperation, America had quietly embedded itself in the region. Forward operating bases were constructed under the name of training. Satellite outposts rose near resource corridors. Drone pads, intel facilities, security liaisons, all painted in the language of stability. But what Traoré began to notice was that every promise of stability came with a price tag, and the receipt was paid by the people. At first it was subtle. A convoy of weapons from the capital would arrive at the wrong village with no record of who authorized the change. A humanitarian shipment from the U.S. would arrive filled with rice that expired 2 years ago, but wrapped in glossy American flags. Mining contracts passed through the desks of ministers Traoré had seen at embassy banquets, laughing a little too loudly. And then there were the soldiers. Traoré's fellow cadets, bright, passionate young men, were quietly selected and flown out to Colorado Springs or Stuttgart for leadership training. They came back different, polished, guarded, all repeating the same phrases. We must strengthen our partnership with the West. Security is our shared responsibility. Africa cannot defend itself alone. It wasn't what they said that disturbed Traoré. It was how identical they sounded, like tape recorders programmed in another hemisphere. Then there was the man whose name Traoré never heard on the news, but saw again and again in classified briefings and diplomatic footnotes, Mike Johnson, a name that echoed through cables and communiques. Officially, he was the Speaker of the House. But in the deeper layers of the American system, Johnson was a broker of strategy, a man who didn't command armies, but could move them. His influence stretched into every U.S. Foreign Aid Committee, military cooperation agreement, and oversight review. He was known for championing African security stabilization initiatives, a phrase that sounded benevolent until you realized what it really meant. Johnson sat in D.C., but his shadow fell across the entire Sahel. In one internal memo Traoré managed to glimpse during a briefing, Johnson had underlined a line in red ink: Burkina Faso is vulnerable but pliable, favorable for operations. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they were said, as if his country were a wrench in someone else's toolbox. By now, Traoré had learned how to stay silent, even as the rage burned hot beneath his skin. He kept notes. He drew maps. He highlighted airstrips being quietly extended near northern borders. He traced shipping manifests from gold mines in the east, resources extracted under foreign joint ventures, leaving only polluted rivers behind. He watched infrastructure loans morph into long-term debt designed to cripple sovereignty under the mask of modernization. And all the while, the people suffered. Fuel shortages became monthly. Schools went without textbooks. Clinics ran out of vaccines. But the embassy walls always gleamed, and armored SUVs never lacked gasoline. At night in his modest room, Traoré would sit at the edge of his bed staring at the bare concrete wall, asking a question he never dared to say out loud. Are we defending our nation or guarding someone else's investment? No one around him seemed to ask. The politicians smiled for the cameras. The ministers toasted imported champagne. And the news told the people stability is coming. Be patient. But Traoré had seen enough to know stability for whom, and at what cost. It was supposed to be just another joint exercise, routine drills under the scorching sun, a display of seamless coordination between Burkina Faso's officers and their American counterparts. On paper, it was labeled Operation Sentinel Harmony. But beneath the protocols and polite smiles, Ibrahim Traoré had learned to read between the lines. He didn't trust drills with names that sounded too poetic, and he certainly didn't trust the man in charge that day, Colonel Debeau, a government loyalist with an expensive watch and eyes that never blinked when he lied. The day was hot, the kind of heat that made your thoughts feel like they were melting inside your skull. Traoré had just returned from a simulated perimeter breach when he was called to the main command tent to review logistics. Most of the officers had gone for lunch. Inside the tent was dim humming with the low static of satellite communication gear. On the table were half a dozen folders marked with different security clearance codes. Traoré reached for the one labeled Resource Movement Clearance, Sector Echo thinking it contained fuel transport schedules. He opened it casually at first, then froze. Inside was a memo unsigned but bearing the watermark of the Ministry of Defense and a U.S. Strategic Development Agency. It detailed a reallocation of development funds, nearly $14 million USD, diverted to community stabilization protocols. That term seemed vague until he saw the attached map. 7 villages circled in red. 3 of them were ones he'd visited on humanitarian escort duty places where clean water was scarce, children still studied under trees, and the only functioning clinic used candlelight at night. The memo referenced civilian influence zones with potential to disrupt regional objectives. And then the last sentence, due to increasing agitation, localized suppression has been authorized. Suppression, not stabilization, not development, just cold clinical suppression with U.S.-approved financing. Traoré stared at the page, hearing nothing but the pounding of his own heartbeat. He looked over his shoulder. No one had noticed. The folder hadn't been locked. He wasn't even supposed to be here, not at this time, not with this much truth in his hands. He memorized every detail, dates, signatures, target names, then closed the folder and placed it back exactly as he found it. When the aide returned and asked if he needed anything, Traoré simply nodded, forced a smile, and stepped back into the blinding sunlight. That evening, while his comrades drank beer and played cards, he sat alone under the same mosquito-netted lantern he had used since cadet school. The world around him hadn't changed, but he had. Something in him had turned. Not anger, not even betrayal. It was clarity. The war they were training for wasn't about foreign terrorists. It wasn't about regional safety. It was about controlling whoever dared ask for more than scraps. The people weren't being protected, they were being pacified. That night in his journal, Traoré wrote only 7 words: "I will not be a pawn." Never again. He closed the book, blew out the lantern, and laid down in the dark, knowing full well that he was now on a different path, one from which there would be no turning back. The invitation came in an envelope thicker than necessary, sealed with a gold-embossed insignia. The kind of invitation that wasn't really optional, especially when it came from General Tano Diallo, the Chief of Armed Forces. An evening of recognition and international camaraderie, it said, written in a font that tried too hard to sound regal. Ibrahim Traoré read the card twice before sliding it into the drawer of his desk. He didn't need to read the fine print. He already knew what the evening would be: a room full of polished boots, polished smiles, and polished lies. The gala was held in the Presidential Officers Club, a building that hadn't seen combat in decades but was outfitted like a fortress. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling, painted with a mural of doves and AK-47s, as if someone had confused peace with enforcement. There were guards at every door dressed in ceremonial uniforms they never wore in the field. American and French flags were displayed discreetly stitched into decorative banners, like quiet fingerprints on the evening's true sponsors. Traoré arrived in his formal dress uniform. He carried no weapon, just the weight of suspicion that had been growing inside him like a pressure chamber since that training drill weeks ago. His eyes scanned the room as if he were assessing a battlefield. Generals, ambassadors, defense contractors, intelligence liaisons pretending to be cultural attachés. One man in particular caught his attention, a tall American with silver hair and a suit too crisp for Africa, laughing a little too comfortably with General Diallo near the bar. The man wasn't on any guest list Traoré had seen, but he didn't need a name to know what he was. The dinner began with protocol speeches, empty praise for cooperation, and shared goals, followed by a choral performance of the national anthem. Traoré applauded politely, his face trained to stay neutral, but underneath he was watching, listening, calculating. It wasn't until after the main course, when the music grew softer and the wine flowed freely, that the real conversations began. Traoré excused himself and drifted toward the library adjacent to the ballroom, a quiet place for cigars and confidences. He wasn't the only one with that idea. Behind the half-closed door, he recognized the voice of the silver-haired American. Smooth, controlled. The kind of voice trained to never sound threatening, even when it was. "The key is keeping them just afloat," the man said. "Flood them with just enough development loans so they can't default without begging. You stabilize through debt, not democracy. Dependency is leverage." A second voice replied, low and accented. "Possibly European. And what about the growing independence movement, Niger, Mali, even here?" A soft chuckle followed. "That's why we have the defense cooperation programs. Military structure buys loyalty. Education buys language. Influence trickles down. Don't fight the fire by the matchbox." Traoré stood motionless, just behind the doorframe. Every word was like acid, carving deeper into a wound he hadn't realized was still open. So it wasn't paranoia, it wasn't idealism, it was strategy. Cold, calculated, corporate. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He'd heard enough. He stepped back and slipped away before the voices faded into another toast. Back in the ballroom, he joined a group of junior officers discussing logistics, his expression as unreadable as always. But inside his mind had gone quiet, not with confusion, but with confirmation. That night as he left the gala and walked into the cooling darkness outside, he felt the weight of something irreversible settle onto his shoulders. He'd seen the outlines of the machine before, but tonight he'd heard its gears turning. And those gears weren't greased with goodwill. They were lubricated with profit fear and the kind of diplomacy that wore silk ties and drank imported scotch while children studied in the dirt. He didn't need another memo, didn't need a classified leak. He just witnessed the doctrine behind it all. Africa didn't need to be conquered, it just needed to be owned piece by piece. As the moonlight fell across the pavement and he stepped into his waiting jeep, a bitter smile touched the corner of his lips. They thought he was still asleep, but Ibrahim Traoré was wide awake. The meeting took place at dawn before the capital awoke, and the air turned heavy with exhaust fumes and bureaucracy. Ibrahim Traoré parked his vehicle beneath a collapsed jacaranda tree in Sector 14, then continued on foot down a narrow alley that smelled faintly of rust and rain. His destination was a crumbling compound at the edge of a forgotten neighborhood where General Salif Diarra had spent his retirement growing vegetables and ignoring politics, or so the public believed. Diarra had once been the youngest brigadier in West Africa, a legend in the early days of transition after the fall of French rule. But history had a strange way of folding its heroes into silence. By the time Traoré was a cadet, Diarra's name had all but disappeared from official training manuals. Still among a certain generation of soldiers, the ones who believed in sovereignty before slogans, his name carried weight. Inside the compound, Diarra waited in a wooden chair beneath a broken ceiling fan. Age had turned his voice into gravel, but his eyes were sharp enough to recognize in Traoré not just respect, but purpose. "You're not here to talk about the weather," Diarra said without rising. Traoré offered a respectful nod. "I need to know what I'm standing on, before I decide whether it's a field or a mine." Diarra didn't answer immediately. He reached behind his chair and pulled out a rusted metal box. Inside were several faded folders bound with rubber bands. He placed them on the table like sacred relics, then with a flick of his hand motioned for Traoré to look. What Traoré found inside made the whispers he'd been hearing feel like children's stories. There were photos, grainy surveillance images of American envoys dining with notorious warlords in Congo. Bank statements showing untraceable funds moving from US-based consulting firms to defense ministries in West Africa. A signed agreement buried under layers of bureaucracy authorizing American private security contractors to operate on Burkinabe soil under immunity clauses. There were even minutes from a confidential summit in Abidjan where U.S. officials had advised African heads of state on how to optimize public compliance through communication control. "These files were never meant to surface," Diarra said quietly. "I kept them because one day someone like you would come looking." Traoré said nothing for a long time. He simply stared at the page in front of him, the signature of a former president who had once been celebrated for his pro-Western alignment. The same man who had closed schools, banned dissent, and purchased riot gear with education funds. "Why didn't you speak out?" Traoré finally asked. Diarra gave a long, tired sigh. "I did. Quietly. They silenced me. Politely. A promotion, a pension, and a permanent place outside the room where decisions were made." Traoré closed the folder. Something had shifted in him. Not anger, he had long passed that threshold. What remained now was something more dangerous, clarity forged in memory. A memory specifically of his father. He had been 10 years old when the police came. His father, a schoolteacher, had been accused of teaching subversive content to primary students, African history that didn't align with the national curriculum. His crime using a handwritten map to show pre-colonial kingdoms, empires led by Africans, not invaders. The officers had taken his chalkboard, his papers, even the books he had written himself. They had also taken his voice. After that night, his father never taught again. For years, Traoré remembered the silence around their dinner table, the shame that came not from guilt, but from knowing the truth and being forbidden to speak it. Now as he sat across from General Diarra, that silence echoed inside him again, but this time he had no intention of honoring it. When he stood to leave, he said only one thing. They erased you from the records, but I'm going to make sure they remember what you tried to do. Diarra gave him a long look, then the faintest of smiles. Then be careful, son. They fear nothing more than a man who remembers. The change didn't happen all at once. There were no bold proclamations, no secret meetings in dark basements. Ibrahim Traoré knew better than to lead with noise. In a system designed to hear dissent before it formed, silence was his greatest weapon. It started with conversations carefully chosen, measured in tone, delivered under the pretense of routine. At the shooting range, he asked about doctrine. In the mess hall, he mentioned historical examples of sovereign resistance. During equipment checks, he quoted Thomas Sankara, not his fiery speeches, but the quiet lines, the ones that made men think. And the young officers listened. They were smart, hungry, and disillusioned children of the same chaos that had shaped him. They had buried classmates killed in protests. They had watched their parents trade dignity for imported rice. They had sworn oaths to a flag that rarely defended them in return. To them, Traoré was more than a superior. He was what conviction looked like when it didn't need to scream. But even quiet winds stir dust. It didn't take long before someone noticed. One evening, while walking back to the barracks after drills, a familiar voice called out behind him. It was Captain Seydou Sanu, an old friend from academy days. They had shared books, rations, and bruises. But now Seydou's expression was tight, cautious. He looked around before speaking. People are starting to talk, Ibrahim, he said, voice low. They say you're asking strange questions, that you're turning heads. Traoré kept walking, his pace unbroken. And what do you say? I say you're playing with fire, Seydou replied, falling in step beside him. This isn't like cadet school. The men you're nudging, some of them are watched. Others are loyal to people with longer knives than yours. Traoré stopped. The street was empty, lit only by the flickering bulb above a checkpoint post. He turned to his friend, eyes steady. That fire, he said, voice, calm but unwavering. It's already in me. Seydou didn't respond immediately. He looked at Traoré as if seeing something both familiar and foreign, a brother he'd trained beside now, burning with a clarity that frightened him. Finally he spoke. Just don't mistake inspiration for immunity. Then he walked away, disappearing into the dark like a warning carried by wind. Traoré stood still for a moment longer, watching the emptiness where his friend had vanished. He didn't feel anger. He understood the fear, but fear was no longer a language he could speak fluently. Not after the files, not after his father's silence, not after the dinner where he had heard Africa reduced to a line item on someone else's balance sheet. In the days that followed, he pressed on, careful, deliberate, but bolder than before. He shared more stories, posed more questions, carried the torch of defiance not like a weapon, but like a mirror reflecting what others had buried beneath duty. And slowly, like sparks gathering along dry grass, something began to spread. A sense of permission, a sense of possibility. He wasn't calling for revolution, not yet, but he was lighting matches in a room full of gas. And somewhere deep inside, he already knew sooner or later someone would strike the flame. At exactly 04:17 a.m., the city of Ouagadougou held its breath. The sky was still dark, the kind of heavy darkness that pressed against windows and whispered of storms that hadn't yet come. But within that stillness, something was moving. Not loud, not violent, just precise. Across the capital, engines purred softly. Convoys rolled on half-lit roads. Footsteps moved in rhythm, boots skimming the earth with a grace that betrayed the steel in their purpose. The men had been briefed the night before, separately, discreetly. Most had never served on the same detail, but all of them knew one thing: today was the day the silence ended. They called it Operation Feu sur Silent Fire. No uniforms, no flags, just discipline and timing. Inside the presidential compound, the guards on night shift were changing over. They didn't notice the pattern, how the replacement officers had all come early, how the fresh crew bore familiar faces but unfamiliar eyes. By the time the command structure realized what was happening, it was already too late. 6 checkpoints were neutralized in under 15 minutes without a single shot. It wasn't because the resistance was weak. It was because the resistance never saw it coming. Phones stopped working. Radios played static. Internal comms were rerouted. What few attempts were made to call for reinforcements were never received. The capital had become a fortress with no walls, and the only ones moving freely within it were the ones who had planned every inch of this operation. In the Ministry of Defense, two high-ranking officials were escorted calmly but firmly from their offices. They were too stunned to resist. They had misread Traoré's silence for submission, misread his calm for complicity. They didn't understand until the moment their badges were stripped that the man they had overlooked had been studying them for years. By 06:03 a.m., the television station's state-run, heavily guarded broadcast only the national anthem on a continuous loop. There were no reporters, no anchors, no breaking news graphics, just the flag rippling in slow motion as if waiting for a new voice to claim it. That voice came at 07:00 a.m. sharp. Standing alone in full fatigues but without rank insignia, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on screen. The room behind him was bare, no gold seal, no military flags, no throne of power. Just concrete and conviction. His words were not shouted. They were delivered with a calm so unnerving that even those who opposed him later would admit he sounded like someone who had already won. Brothers and sisters of Burkina Faso. The hour of silence has ended. For too long our nation has bent to the will of those who do not live here, do not suffer here, do not believe in our future. Today we take back the pen that writes our story. No threats, no vengeance, just clarity. The speech lasted 4 minutes. That was all it took. By 10:15 a.m., the former president had been escorted to a secure location. No gunfire, no mass protests, no chaos, just an eerie stillness as if the country had exhaled all at once. And beyond its borders, the world blinked. In Washington, staffers scrambled to write statements without using the word coup. In Paris, diplomats cursed quietly into their coffee. Intelligence analysts scanned footage in disbelief. They had seen African uprisings before, usually noisy, often bloody. But this was surgical. 6 hours. No shots fired. No bodies on the ground. Just power transferred, not by force, but by precision and resolve. The West called it unthinkable. The people of Burkina Faso called it inevitable. And as the sun finally rose over the capital, touching the rooftops and illuminating the quiet streets below, Traoré stood at the top of the military command tower, his gaze cast not on the city but far beyond it. This was not the end. This was the ignition. The speech was not pre-recorded, it was live, unfiltered, intentional. At exactly 12 hours noon, every television, radio station, and live stream inside Burkina Faso and in scattered satellite feeds across the continent shifted to a single frame, a podium set against the stark backdrop of the old parliamentary chamber. No ornate banners, no military regalia, just the new national flag hung by hand only hours earlier. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the frame not with the posture of a dictator, nor the swagger of a triumphant rebel, but with the calm command of a man who had waited long enough to speak and knew the world had no choice but to listen. The cameras whirred silently. His hands rested lightly on either side of the podium, fingers motionless. He did not glance at notes. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, and devastatingly clear. To the people of Burkina Faso, to our brothers and sisters across Africa, and to those watching us from foreign capitals, know this: Africa is no one's experiment. We are not your battleground. We are not your security laboratory. We are not your mineral vault. We are our own future. And from this moment forward, we will decide how that future unfolds. Outside the chamber in the city's central square, a crowd of thousands watched on a makeshift screen constructed overnight by university students. They had gathered hesitantly, at first unsure if this was another false dawn, another changing of faces beneath the same foreign leash. But as the words poured from the speakers, doubt turned to stillness, stillness into breath, breath into roaring voices. By the time Traoré continued, they were chanting his name. We have been told to wait for democracy to mature, wait for economies to stabilize. While we waited, our children went hungry, our doctors worked without gloves, and our land was sold in contracts we never saw. That wait ends today. He didn't need to name names. Not the former president, not the foreign sponsors behind him. The people knew. So did the satellites beaming the speech into international intelligence rooms. So did the ears in embassies already drafting exit strategies. What made the message hit harder than any bullet was its refusal to tremble. There was no hatred, no vengeance, just a reclamation of voice. We do not reject cooperation, but we will not accept control. If you come with respect, you will find partners. If you come with terms carved in silence, you will leave disappointed. At that, a brief pause. He scanned the lens. It was a gaze without apology. To the youth of this continent, do not be afraid of your history, do not be ashamed of your power, and do not wait for permission to be sovereign. Stand, think, build. When the screen cut to black, the crowd didn't scatter. They stayed chanting, dancing, lifting their flag high above the square, like it was being raised for the first time in truth. In towns miles away, farmers stopped their work to huddle around radios. In dusty classrooms, teachers who had long avoided politics dared to smile again. A generation raised in disappointment heard something rare, their own voice spoken aloud without apology from a podium of power. But not all who listened were cheering. Thousands of miles away inside a gray briefing room in Washington, Speaker Mike Johnson stood silently as his aides replayed a clipped excerpt of the speech. Africa is no one's experiment. He didn't say a word, didn't blink, just clenched his jaw and turned toward the intelligence chief at his side. Tell me everything we know about this man. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and panic disguised as professionalism. It was just after 6 a.m. in Washington when the alert came through. Not a bomb, not a cyber attack, just a man, a speech, a voice that had crossed an ocean and pierced the polished walls of American power with the sharpness of unwelcome truth. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered, and there he was, Ibrahim Traoré, young, calm, no prepared notes, just presence. His speech was being replayed, sentence by sentence, analyzed in real time by intelligence officers from 3 different departments: national security, defense, economic strategy. Words were highlighted, phrases tagged, facial expressions studied for intent cadence, measured for radical leanings. It didn't matter that Traoré hadn't called for violence. He had committed something far more dangerous. He had inspired clarity. At the head of the room sat Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House and unofficial power broker for everything in the global engagement portfolio. He had weathered coups before, rebellions too, but none had felt quite like this. Who is this kid, he snapped, not even looking at the screen. Where the hell did he come from? A young analyst stammered, captain in the Burkina Bay Army, trained locally, top percentile in tactical command. No major international files, sir. Until now, he wasn't even on our second-tier asset watch list. Johnson leaned forward, elbows on the table. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but his voice was clear and cold. You're telling me we were blindsided by someone we didn't even have flagged? The room went silent. A few seconds passed before the Undersecretary of Economic Operations cleared her throat and spoke. Sir, we're tracking signals across West Africa. Social sentiment is shifting rapidly. Protests in Mali have already turned celebratory. Hashtags referencing Traoré are trending across African diasporas. Pan-African media is syndicating the speech in real time. Johnson turned away from the screen. His jaw tightened. He's not just taking over a country, he muttered. He's lighting a fuse. Within an hour, a separate meeting had been arranged, one without press, without transcripts. The type of meeting where no one wore flags and everyone spoke in code. Pentagon officials arrived in plain suits. Advisors from the State Department spoke in contingency terms. Representatives from financial institutions listened closely, taking silent notes. Destabilization through economic leverage is our fastest option, someone offered. IMF loan recall, aid suspension, sanctions on rare earth exports. Media pressure too, another added. Get ahead of the narrative. Paint him as reckless, militaristic, unpredictable. Or worse, someone in the back said quietly, frame him as the next Sankara. The room hushed at the name. That was the comparison everyone feared and the one everyone understood. Mike Johnson rose slowly from his seat. The room followed. I want options, real ones, not just headlines. I want to know who he talks to, who protects him, what his weaknesses are. If he so much as breathes near a Russian diplomat, I want eyes on it. He paused, glancing around the table. Don't treat him like a local anomaly. Treat him like a global disruptor. Because if this catches on, if this fire spreads, we're going to lose more than just Burkina Faso. And with that, the room emptied, plans already forming in whispers. From that moment on, one name would echo through Washington's war rooms, think tanks, embassy cables, and risk assessments. Ibrahim Traoré. Not as a threat to stability, but as a threat to control. The blow didn't come with tanks or bombs. It came through fax machines, financial terminals, and statements drafted by men in tailored suits. Just 72 hours after Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed the world, the first sanction landed: a press release from the U.S. Treasury citing concerns over constitutional order in Burkina Faso. It was phrased carefully in diplomatic language, wrapped in legal ambiguity, but the impact was immediate. Frozen accounts, suspended banking privileges, visa restrictions for top military officials. Then came the IMF. Citing governance instability and a deterioration of fiscal transparency, the institution abruptly withdrew its loan disbursement scheduled for the following quarter. The $120 million line meant to stabilize fuel imports and food subsidies disappeared overnight. In Washington, they called it leverage. In Ouagadougou, it felt like a noose tightening around the nation's throat. Gas stations ran dry by the end of the week. Public buses stopped mid-route and never restarted. Markets grew tense. Electricity flickered and faded, particularly in rural regions that had always existed on the edge of the grid. In the north, entire villages went dark. The capital fell into an eerie stillness, a blackout not of light, but of certainty. Traoré met daily with his provisional council, studying logistics like a general, mapping a battlefield made of spreadsheets. Diesel reserves, grain storage, private sector resilience. They would need to improvise ration barter. He issued orders to prioritize power to hospitals, to reallocate military transport for emergency food deliveries, to mobilize engineers for solar deployment in government buildings. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Outside, the people held on, but barely. Whispers returned to the streets, whispers of fear, of whether the young captain, for all his words, could hold a country together with nothing but defiance and strategy. And in Washington, the pressure continued to mount. Behind closed doors in a sleek gray conference room on K Street, Mike Johnson sat across from 6 defense contractors, 2 former ambassadors, and 1 ex-CIA regional chief. A projection screen displayed satellite images of the region Burkina Faso, glowing red in the center of a fragile geopolitical web. He's inspiring copycats, the ex-ambassador said. There's talk in Niger, Mali, even parts of Chad. Youth movements referencing his speech, organizing around him as a symbol. We warned you, said one contractor sipping from a glass of still water. You leave a vacuum, and someone's going to fill it. This Traoré didn't stumble into power. He's been planning this for years. Johnson didn't respond. He stared at the image of the red outline glowing on the map like a wound. We can't let this rebellion spread, he said finally. We have too much invested in stability across that corridor. The uranium lines, the drone network, trade corridors through Ghana. If Burkina becomes a blueprint, we'll be cleaning up flashpoints across the whole region. What's your move? The intelligence officer asked. We keep pressure on the financial side, Johnson said. Squeeze hard, but stay clean. Meanwhile, we introduce friction, subtle, indirect. Supply chain disruptions, delay their port access through coastal allies, incentivize neighboring countries to diplomatically isolate him. And if he leans too far into anti-Western alliances, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone at the table knew what came after the if. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré sat in the darkened strategy room, a single candle flickering beside a radio unit as reports filtered in. Rural farmers now rationed cooking oil. Fuel riots were breaking out near the borders. A truck carrying rice had been hijacked by a group claiming to be loyal to the old government. Foreign aid NGOs were suspending operations. And yet when he looked out his window, he still saw something remarkable. People were not running. They were adjusting. They were tightening belts, sharing resources. Teachers were holding open-air classes. Mechanics were converting generators to run on biofuel. Students were organizing food drives. It wasn't hope yet, but it was resistance made real. He looked at his aide and said calmly, If they want to starve us into silence, they've never understood who we are. In the weeks that followed the sanctions, the nation didn't collapse. It adapted. Traoré had expected hardship. He had calculated food scarcity, fuel panic, rising black market prices. But what even he hadn't fully foreseen, what none of the analysts in Washington or Brussels had factored into their risk assessments, was the quiet fire of solidarity that ignited across the country. It began in the countryside. Farmers who had once sold their harvests at low margins to French cooperatives now withheld their produce from the supply chains and began donating to local distribution points. Trucks labeled People's Harvest appeared in villages and cities alike, unloading yams, maize millet, onions, bundled not for sale, but for survival. In the southern province of Comoé University, students abandoned lectures to dig irrigation ditches by hand-building communal gardens behind schoolhouses. Elders, some of whom had once marched during Sankara's revolution in the 80s, dug into what little they had left, modest savings stored in coffee tins and cloth pouches, and offered it to their neighborhoods. "This is not charity," one elder told a reporter. "This is memory. We've been here before, and this time we will finish what we started." In marketplaces, bartering returned in place of currency, eggs for flour, soap for fabric, services traded with honor, not debt. But it was the women who rose loudest. In city centers and rural crossroads, groups of mothers, vendors, nurses, teachers, women with tired hands and sharpened voices began to chant. First in local dialects, then in French, then across radio stations and phone-recorded videos uploaded to social media. "Let the dogs of the empire starve, we feed our own." The chant caught on like wildfire. At first it was whispered, then it was shouted, then it was painted on walls, etched into wood, sewn into fabric. In the capital, an entire mural was painted along the west wall of the National Hospital, a woman standing over a cooking pot, defiant and barefoot, ladling stew into the hands of children as broken chains lay at her feet. Foreign observers called it dangerous nationalism. Traoré called it clarity made visible. The country's situation remained dire. There was no illusion of comfort. But what replaced dependency was a strange, electrifying pride. They were being starved, yes, but not into silence. If anything, it made their voices louder, clearer. Traoré watched this unfold not from above, but among them. He refused to retreat into presidential compounds or be paraded in convoys. He visited schoolhouses barefoot, helped dig trenches in villages, ate simple meals, refused imported wine, and often wore the same faded uniform. He had become less a symbol of command and more a mirror reflecting the very people who had put their hope in him. On one particularly hot afternoon, as he visited a makeshift granary in Koudougou, a young girl no older than 9 approached him shyly, holding a dented metal bowl with a few kernels of sorghum inside. "For the country," she said simply. He knelt down and looked her in the eye. "And for your future," he whispered. Behind them the chant rose again. "Let the dogs of the empire starve." It wasn't just defiance, it was healing through defiance. Back in Washington, intelligence analysts scrolled through footage of rallies and murals with disbelief. Sanctions, they had assumed, would create desperation, then backlash. They were seeing backlash, yes, but it wasn't against Traoré. It was against them. This, Johnson realized, wasn't just economic resistance. It was emotional revolution, a hunger turned inward, redirected into self-sufficiency and cultural restoration. The empire had underestimated its opponent. Because what do you do, he wondered bitterly, when the people refused to be broken? It happened just past midnight along a desolate stretch of road outside Tenkodogo, where the horizon swayed with heat even in the dark. Traoré's convoy had just left a meeting with agricultural cooperatives. No media, no cameras, just a dusty trail, and 2 military trucks flanking his armored SUV. There had been no warning, no radio interference, no sign in the sky, only silence followed by a high-frequency buzz no human ear could detect. 12,000 feet above them, a Reaper drone circled, programmed to acquire its target without ever crossing official airspace. The launch hadn't come from the Pentagon, of course. Not directly. It was flagged under a joint task code registered to a private defense contractor. The origin point A base in Niger used informally by Western intelligence assets. The drone locked on. Target SUV, matte black approximate signature match. Clearance authorized. And then nothing. The screen flickered. A warning message appeared: GPS interference signal compromised. The lock was lost. Guidance scrambled. By the time the drone recalibrated, the convoy had changed formation. Two decoy vehicles shifted routes. The real SUV was gone. Someone had been waiting for this. Back on the ground, Traoré never flinched. He had already been briefed days earlier. Intercepts suggested an operation was imminent. He said nothing at the time, only adjusted his movement pattern and activated Protocol Eclipse, a counter-surveillance strategy developed months ago by his inner security team. But it wasn't just the drone that failed. It was the mole that gave it away. A junior communications officer recently transferred, recently promoted, recently spending too much time near encrypted systems, was intercepted trying to transmit a location ping to an offshore relay. He didn't make it past the gates. In a secure room beneath the military intelligence building, he sat sweating under a single bulb, eyes darting, lips trembling. He offered a dozen excuses, then names, then begged. Traoré never raised his voice. He simply walked into the room, dismissed the guards, and looked the young man in the eye. "We don't punish you," he said. "You've already done that yourself." Then he left as silently as he had come. 2 hours later, a video was broadcast on national television and across all government social platforms. Traoré appeared in front of a charcoal gray wall, the Burkinabe flag draped behind him. There were no notes, no teleprompter, just him in plain fatigue speaking to a country that had already been forced to survive everything. "We are not afraid of shadows," he said calmly, eyes steady, "because we have walked without light before. We are not afraid of those who fly above us in silence, because we have learned to move like the earth, quiet, patient, and inevitable." He didn't mention the drone. He didn't need to. The people knew. The message wasn't for the locals. It was for those watching from elsewhere, across oceans, across screens, across boardrooms where death was scheduled on spreadsheets and masked as national interest. He ended the message simply: "You can target coordinates, but you will never target conviction." And with that, he stepped away from the podium. The screen went black. In Washington, Mike Johnson stared at the transcript on his tablet. The kill attempt had failed. The public knew. And worse, Traoré had gained something even more powerful than safety. Legend. For weeks, Traoré had said nothing. No retaliation, no names, no press conferences full of fury. Even after the assassination attempt, he stayed composed. He let the world believe he was cornered, left to ration fuel and outmaneuver drones. He played the part so convincingly that even his enemies began to think he was surviving, but not winning. Then came the leak. It was a quiet Friday morning when the video first appeared, posted to a barely known Telegram channel at 4:12 a.m. GMT, with a caption in all lowercase 42 seconds that explained everything. No filters, no dramatic intro, just a gray waveform, a timestamp, and one voice. "Look, I'm not interested in a stable Africa. We keep them just hungry enough to obey, but not enough to rebel. That's the lever. You take away that lever, and what do you have? Another continent full of angry kids with nothing to lose. And Wi-Fi." The voice was unmistakable: Mike Johnson. Clipped from what insiders would later confirm was a private strategy call with select members of a foreign policy roundtable. The 42-second clip was more than just damning, it was clarifying. There were no code words, no deniable euphemisms, just a sentence so raw, so surgically cruel, it cut through every layer of political theater. Just hungry enough to obey. By 6:00 a.m., the clip had been downloaded, mirrored, translated, subtitled, remixed, and uploaded to every major platform. Hashtags began trending in multiple languages. Hashtag 42 seconds. Not your lever. We heard you. In Lagos, activists projected the audio waveform onto the side of a federal building. In Nairobi University, students marched holding posters that read, "Don't feed us, free us." In Johannesburg, a local DJ sampled the voice into a protest track that topped local charts within 24 hours. In Paris, a government spokesperson declined to comment. In London, journalists asked if British officials had ever been part of similar strategy sessions. In New York, CNN cut to commercial mid-segment after a former ambassador went off script, calling the tape the single most damaging admission of neocolonial intent in modern diplomatic history. And in Washington, chaos quietly unfolded behind closed doors. Mike Johnson stood in a dark-paneled war room watching the transcript scroll across a secure monitor. The clip was authentic. There was no denying it. They could spin yes, but denial. That was gone. Someone on that call had leaked the audio. And the timing, Johnson realized, was not random. It was surgical. He slammed his fist on the table. Where the hell is this coming from? I want cyber forensics. I want internal comms scrubbed. I want names. But it was too late. The leak hadn't come from some hacker. It had been timed and staged by someone who understood how to aim truth like a weapon. And it hadn't been dropped onto Western networks. It had been seeded inside Africa, allowing the fire to spread from the ground up before any global entity could contain it. In Ouagadougou, Traoré didn't hold a press conference. He didn't post a gloating message. Instead, he visited a rural primary school in Bobo Dioulasso, sat with students, read from a textbook written in Moray, ate lunch with the teachers. When a journalist asked him about the tape, he simply replied, "I did not release the voice of America. I simply allowed the people to hear it." That evening, a national broadcast featured the 42-second clip played over slow images of Burkina Faso dried fields, closed clinics, empty fuel drums, and finally crowds of people holding up hand-painted signs that read, "We are not your strategy." The leak wasn't just a scandal, it was a mirror held to the face of Western foreign policy and to millions across the global South who had long suspected the truth, but had never heard it spoken aloud in an American voice with American arrogance in perfect clarity. From that moment forward, Traoré didn't just lead a country, he led a movement. The footage didn't fade. It detonated. By the time the sun rose over New York City, the 42-second audio clip had passed through millions of ears, leaving behind a ringing that would not fade. It wasn't just an international scandal, it was a domestic reckoning. By 10:00 a.m., crowds began gathering in Harlem and South Chicago and Atlanta and Oakland, places where people didn't need a translator to understand what was said. They had heard that tone before. The paternalism, the cold calculus, the notion that obedience was currency and that hunger was strategy. Signs emerged from handmade cardboard and Sharpie pens. "Just hungry enough, we are not your lever. Africa is family, not a farm." And from the younger generation, 42 seconds, she 400 years. At first, the protests were small, passionate but contained. But by nightfall, they had become organized acts of dissent. Universities held emergency panels. Black church leaders issued joint statements. Prominent voices in the African American community took to live streams demanding clarity, accountability, apology. This wasn't foreign policy anymore. It was personal. In Los Angeles, a crowd surrounded the West Coast offices of a major defense contractor known to operate in West Africa. In Washington, D.C., demonstrators stood outside the Capitol chanting, "Show us the rest of the tape." And inside the White House, everything moved faster than the press could catch up. Mike Johnson, once revered as the great strategist of America's foreign stability doctrine, now stood at a podium, visibly cracking under pressure. What had once been his greatest strength, his unshakable composure, now betrayed him. The words didn't come easily. His eyes darted too quickly. His mouth formed sentences that didn't quite finish. The clip in question was taken out of context. It doesn't reflect our official stance on African development. The journalist from Reuters didn't let it go. "Sir, are you denying that it's your voice?" Johnson hesitated just for half a second, but it was enough. "I cannot confirm the authenticity of the specific audio file." Wrong answer. That clip, those 42 seconds, weren't just about Africa anymore. They were about the mechanics of manipulation. They had become a case study in moral exposure. Johnson had tried to run foreign policy like a machine, but now the gears had frozen and the world could hear them grinding. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso transformed into a media hotspot. Reporters from BBC, Al Jazeera, Le Monde, Deutsche Welle, The Guardian, and the New York Times flew in desperate to profile the man who had sent Washington reeling with a few well-timed seconds of truth. They were met not by staged ceremonies or PR agents, but by what many of them described as the most quietly organized populist government they'd ever seen. Traoré gave no exclusive interviews. Instead, he released a short statement through Burkina Faso's national broadcaster. "If truth causes instability, perhaps it is not the truth that should be questioned, The line appeared on the front page of the Washington Post the next morning. Below it, a new poll showed Johnson's trust rating had plummeted 28% in just 3 days, a faster collapse than any sitting speaker in modern U.S. history. In the halls of Congress, quiet whispers turned into loud questions. Committee chairs began requesting documents. Leaked emails hinted at internal finger-pointing. Johnson's staff started to thin. And for the first time in over a decade, his name stopped opening doors. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré walked through a children's hospital with no cameras following him. He paused at the neonatal wing. A generator recently fixed by volunteer engineers kept the incubators alive. As he watched the machines hum, a nurse approached. "We saw the protests in America," she said softly. "Do you think they'll listen now?" Traoré didn't answer right away. Then, with the same calm that had once unnerved generals and rattled empires, he said, "They don't need to listen. They just need to feel it." And they were. The room was colder than it looked. Inside the great marble chamber of the United Nations General Assembly, delegates shuffled in with practiced grace. Translations clicked softly into earpieces. Notes were reviewed, ties adjusted. Behind polished nameplates, expressions remained neutral. At the far end of the hall, a small digital sign flickered to life. Burkina Faso, Representative Captain Ibrahim Traoré. There had been objections to his presence. Quiet ones. Procedural ones. Some argued he wasn't a recognized head of state. Others insisted his invitation was premature. But none could deny the obvious anymore. His voice was being heard everywhere except here. And today that changed. As Traoré stepped up to the podium, the room didn't quiet in anticipation. It quieted in discomfort. To many of them, he represented a break in protocol, an anomaly, a challenge they hadn't consented to face. He stood without notes as always. Dressed in a clean, earth-toned suit, not military garb, not symbolic costume, just dignity in fabric form. He waited for the room to settle. Then he began. "Excellencies, for decades we have been told we needed your democracy, that we must learn your systems, adopt your models, follow your blueprints. We were told that development comes from obedience, that sovereignty must be sponsored, that freedom, if not funded by you, was a dangerous idea." He paused. The translators scrambled to catch up. A few pens stopped mid-note. "We listened. We negotiated. We complied. And in return, our leaders were chosen in your rooms, not our villages. Our budgets were balanced by your spreadsheets, not our needs. Our silence was mistaken for consent." He looked up, gaze direct, not accusatory, not pleading, measured, surgical. And then 42 seconds of audio made the world tremble. Not because it was false, but because it was true. And truth, it seems, is more dangerous than bullets. Now the chamber stirred. A few heads turned toward each other, eyes narrowed. Some whispered, but no one interrupted. So perhaps today, he continued, "We should ask a new question. For decades, we were told we needed your democracy, but perhaps it is your democracy that now needs truth." And there it was, the sentence that shattered the air. The silence afterward lasted a breath too long, just enough to register the collective discomfort of exposed certainty. Then from the center of the African bloc, a single diplomat began to clap. One beat, two, another followed from the Caribbean, then one from Southeast Asia, then more, until it was no longer isolated applause. It was sustained recognition, not of power, but of moral clarity. Even some who had once labeled him a destabilizing force now sat back in silence, no longer sure where they stood. Because in that moment, Traoré didn't sound like a rebel. He sounded like a mirror. He concluded without flourish, "We do not seek to lead the world, only ourselves. And that, with all due respect, is not a request." He stepped down his seat, already prepared beside smaller nations that had never dreamed of standing at the center of the world stage. As he sat, a senior European diplomat whispered to her aide almost bitterly, "He just rewrote the rulebook." Yes, he had. And this time, the silence that followed was not compliance. It was respect. It started in whispers, as all real movements do. In Mali, a group of university students painted a mural near Bamako's main roundabout, Traoré's silhouette above a broken chain, his eyes fixed on the horizon. At the bottom, a single word written in red, Burkinafi. No one had to explain what it meant. To Burkinafi was no longer a geographic reference. It was a verb, a challenge, a declaration. It meant to stand, to refuse, to take ownership without permission. In Niger Street, artists scribbled his quotes on battered concrete walls, lines once spoken to rural school children, now echoed by market vendors, bus drivers, mothers holding infants in arms. You do not need their applause to be legitimate. Sovereignty is not a gift. It is a birthright. In Conakry, Guinea, a group of teenage girls previously silenced under cultural codes of respectful distance from politics began recording short videos of themselves reading excerpts of Traoré's UN speech. By the end of the week, those videos had been translated into over 20 languages: Moore, Hausa, Wolof, Lingala, Swahili, French, Arabic, Yoruba, Zarma, and even Korean and Spanish. What began in Burkina Faso had become a continental lexicon. West African youth began organizing without asking permission, rallies, not led by party slogans, but by collective purpose. Across student campuses, barbershops, cafes, and farm co-ops. Traoré's voice became more than a name. It was a code of belief. Even outside the continent, diaspora communities began holding Burkina Nights gatherings, where young Africans abroad shared poetry, music, and strategies for local empowerment. In London, a cafe in Brixton changed its Wi-Fi password to Burkinafi 2025. In Toronto, the University of Guelph held a symposium titled Beyond the Aid Narrative: What Traoré Taught the West. And through it all, Traoré remained measured. He issued no calls to arms, no sweeping declarations of Pan-African unity, no demands for allegiance. Instead, he focused on small things: rebuilding schools, strengthening seed programs, launching a free history curriculum written by local scholars. His belief was simple but radical. If we build strong minds, we will never need to beg for strong hands. Western media began referring to the phenomenon grudgingly as the African Spring. The term made some uncomfortable, especially in foreign ministries that still remembered the Arab Spring and its geopolitical consequences. But this time, it wasn't about regime change or imported blueprints. It was about language, identity, truth. In Senegal, a radio host signed off with, "We are no longer waiting. We are remembering." In Ghana, a popular hip-hop artist released a track titled "Rebellion is Rural Sampling." Traoré's UN speech over a beat made from kalimba and bass drum. It topped streaming platforms across Africa in under 48 hours. And in Burkina Faso itself, the change was most profound, not in what people said, but in how they moved with steadier steps, lifted chins, conversations that ended not in complaint, but in plans. For the first time in living memory, youth were no longer debating whether the future belonged to them. They were already living in it. One late evening, a journalist asked a 16-year-old in Niamey why she had spray-painted Traoré's face on the side of a commuter bus. Her answer was simple: because they tried to make us feel small. But now we know we are not. And just like that, the fire that began with one voice now danced across 1,000 borders, uninvited, unstoppable, and entirely their own. It began, as most political downfalls do, with a whisper wrapped in a leak. 3 weeks after the 42-second tape went viral, another document surfaced, this one far more damning. A CIA memorandum stamped confidential. Eyes only dated 18 months prior surfaced on a whistleblower site. Its title was short, surgical, and stunning: Operation Eagle Farm. The memo spread over 7 pages, detailed an internal strategy to monitor influence, and in some cases directly fund electoral shifts in resource-heavy African nations. Among them, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, and Chad. The language was bureaucratic, precise, and unmistakably colonial in tone. Election outcomes deemed counter to U.S. strategic interests may require narrative management or candidate recalibration, facilitated through vetted media platforms and partner NGOs. The last 2 pages bore a summary of cost projections and a list of congressional sponsors. Mike Johnson's name appeared 3 times. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere: Eagle Farm exposed democracy on America's terms leaked CIA docs. Spark uproar on Capitol Hill. Johnson linked to covert African electoral plan. Public reaction was swift and visceral. Social media erupted. Activists and academics called it a second Watergate. Protesters returned to the steps of Capitol Hill, holding signs that read, "Not in our name." Democracy can't be exported if you've never unboxed it. Africa is not your farm. On the House floor, Ethics Committee members filed a formal request for investigation into Johnson's private foreign policy dealings. The speaker, once untouchable, now stood exposed, his carefully cultivated image eroded by the slow, relentless drip of undeniable truth. News anchors who once praised his strategic vision now questioned his judgment. Op-eds appeared daily calling for his resignation. Former allies distanced themselves. One senator, speaking off the record, described him as political radiation. No one wants to stand too close. Inside the Capitol, Johnson's once loyal staffers began resigning. His communications director left first, then his chief of staff, then a legislative aide who in her resignation letter quoted Traoré's UN speech, "Perhaps it is your democracy that now needs truth." Behind closed doors, Johnson scrambled to contain the fallout. He issued a brief statement denying involvement, claiming the memo was misinterpreted, the signatures procedural. But no one believed him, not really. The phrasing was too familiar. The strategy too in line with everything the public had already heard in his own voice. The storm refused to pass. Cable news ran split screens, on one side clips of Johnson fumbling through a press conference, on the other Traoré planting trees beside school children in eastern Burkina Faso. One man's empire was crumbling. The other was building something quietly powerful. In a late-night segment, a commentator on PBS asked, "Is this the end of Mike Johnson or the beginning of a very different America?" The answer, no one could say for sure. But in living rooms across the U.S., the name Eagle Farm was now burned into public memory, not as a classified operation, but as a symbol of everything that had gone unchecked for too long. And Johnson, he wasn't just under investigation. He was in retreat. The summit took place not in a marble palace or five-star hotel, but inside a converted university lecture hall in Ouagadougou. The walls were painted by local students. The seats were uneven. The fans creaked under the heat. And yet the energy inside pulsed like a heartbeat long denied. For the first time in over 70 years, heads of state and military leaders from across the African continent gathered without the shadow of Western oversight. No foreign observers, no World Bank delegates, no IMF economists in dark suits taking silent notes in the back row. It was a meeting born not out of formal diplomacy, but from necessity, clarity, and momentum. And it was Traoré who called them there. He stood behind a modest wooden lectern, his speech handwritten and folded in his breast pocket, not because he needed it, but because his mother had told him long ago, "A man who prepares his words respects his listeners." He spoke in French, then paused, repeated each line in Moray, then again in Bambara. No translator, just fluency born of conviction. "For too long," he said, "our borders have been used to divide us. But we did not draw these lines. They were drawn by those who needed us weaker, poorer, separate." He scanned the room not for applause, but for attention. "I do not stand here to ask for allegiance. I ask only for logic. No single nation can defend its land from those who mine it without permission. No leader can protect his people while isolated by design. Unity is not idealism, it is survival." Then he introduced the framework, the Pan-African Defense Pact. It wasn't a military alliance in the traditional sense. It wasn't built on nuclear threats or arms races. Instead, it promised shared intelligence on foreign interference, joint funding for independent resource protection, a rotating peacekeeping initiative not funded by outside governments, but by the continent itself. And above all, a principle of non-interference from non-African actors in internal political transitions. There was no thunderous applause, just a silence that carried weight, the kind that filled rooms when history bent in real time. Then slowly, one by one, leaders began to sign. Mali, Niger, Guinea, Togo, Chad, Central African Republic. By the end of the summit, 11 nations had agreed in principle, and 4 signed immediately. It wasn't just a pact. It was a signal that Africa was no longer waiting for permission to defend its own dignity. Across the continent, news of the agreement spread like morning light. Farmers listened on solar-powered radios. Children repeated the name Pan-African Defense Pact like a chant. Academics debated it. Elders cried quietly. Not because it solved everything, but because it proved something long doubted, that Africa could stand together on its own terms. In Nairobi, a columnist wrote, "For decades we have been told unity was our weakness. Traoré proved it might be our only strength." In Cape Town, a retired general whispered to his grandson, "We fought for this once, and now maybe we will live to see it." And in Ouagadougou, on the final night of the summit, as the leaders exited the hall beneath a bright desert moon, someone had spray painted on the wall, "Hope lives here now." And this time the world was watching. The room was quiet, just the sound of the wind outside and the gentle breath of a newborn sleeping in a woven cradle. Traoré sat at a small wooden desk with a dim lamp and a blank sheet of paper. No guards, no aides. Just a pen and a man who had carried a nation and now cradled something even more fragile. His son had been born 2 weeks earlier, and tonight he wrote him a letter. "My son, you were born free, not because I fought the world, but because I believed in it enough to fight for a better version of it. You will grow up hearing stories about what we did. Some will call it rebellion, others revolution. But to me, it was simply remembering who we were before we were told to forget. Your name carries no burden, but it carries a map. One that will not lead you to wealth, but to truth. And truth is where real freedom begins." He paused, then wrote slower. "There will be those who will try to tell you how small you are. Don't let them, and never wait for the world to love you before you begin to build it. If I am remembered for anything, I hope it is not that I changed the game, but that I reminded our people we were always playing on the wrong field. I do not expect your path to be easy. I only ask you to walk it with honor. Your mother and I gave you life, but it is you who will give meaning to it." He signed the letter, folded it, and placed it beneath a carved wooden box. The baby stirred in the cradle. Traoré looked over, smiled softly, and whispered, "Your world is different now." And it was. The cabin was deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Far from D.C., far from the marble, the microphones, the cameras, the corridors of power that once opened for him with a single nod. Mike Johnson had retired. No speech, no farewell banquet, no line of journalists asking for comment. Just silence, the kind that grows around a man whose name has been carefully removed from the rooms he once commanded. He spent his days fishing, watching cable news, and reading old notes he once sent to generals and CEOs. But lately, even those had begun to feel like fossils from a world that had shifted beneath his feet. One evening, he turned on the television and caught an interview with Traoré, now a leader admired across continents, speaking about education, agriculture, and healing. No fire, no vengeance, just clarity. Johnson watched without blinking. When the segment ended, he poured a glass of scotch and walked outside. The trees rustled gently. Somewhere deep in him, a bitter thought surfaced. He had not been beaten by an army, not even by a movement. He had been outmatched by belief. That was what stung most. And as the wind carried the sound of distant thunder across the hills, Johnson stood in his quiet cabin, a man not destroyed but forgotten. The school was still unfinished, but the walls were up, the windows wide, and the classrooms full of chalkboard dreams. In a village once written off as unreachable, concrete had risen not from foreign contracts but from local hands. Traoré walked slowly down the dusty path between buildings, nodding to the teachers, pausing to watch a group of children recite lessons in unison. A young boy, barefoot, shirt untucked, stood from the crowd and raised his hand in salute. Traoré smiled and returned it, not with the crispness of military formality, but with the quiet respect of a man who recognized something bigger than command. The boy didn't speak. He didn't need to. As Traoré turned toward the open field beyond the school, the narrator's voice echoed not in triumph, but in quiet awe. He didn't conquer the world. He woke it up. And somewhere in the breeze, the chant returned, not loud, not forced, just honest. Burkinafi. Sometimes it takes just one calm voice to challenge a noisy empire. Ibrahim Traoré didn't rise by shouting louder. He rose by standing firmer. His story reminds us that true power isn't in weapons or wealth, but in truth spoken without fear. In a world where silence often equals survival, he chose to speak and shook nations awake. What would you stand for if you knew the world was watching? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.